It's lovely to see you, everybody. I'm going to talk for about 15 to 20 minutes until I see people getting bored and falling asleep. I'm going to talk about, we can talk about anything much that you want to talk about, because we cover virtually everything that people in London and around Britain get involved in. But I thought I'd give you a short talk about a piece of work that we do every few years, which looks at what we know about the world, how it's changing, and some of the things that we know that are certain and some of the things that we know are a bit less certain. All of this stuff is available. If you email me, you can have anything I talk about today. You can have PowerPoint or slides, and you can do anything you like with it. If I say something stupid, do stop me and get me to explain myself. Otherwise, we'll have a discussion at the end. I'm going to talk about what people think and how attitudes in this country and around the world are changing. But before I do that, I want to talk about some things that are certain. Now, those of you who follow politics may know that opinion polling about politics can be difficult. We're not always right. And in fact, there's an American professor called Professor Tetlock who's written a book about forecasting. And he went and looked at 3,000 predictions about the future by people like me about politics, by economists, by people who write about sport, by people who write about science. And what he then did was went back and checked whether or not predictions by experts like me actually come true or not. And what he found was that basically people like me are about 5% more accurate than random chance. So any mathematicians in the room will know that this isn't brilliant. It gives you an edge, but it's not perfect. But at the same time, there are some things that we know are certain, that will happen during your lifetimes. And exactly how those play out, we're less sure about. But these are things that we can quickly go through. So the first is, clearly technology will happen. It will continue developing. I always find it amazing that there are 3.3 billion transistors in this phone. The thing that sent the Americans to the moon in 1969 had 12,000, and that was the most impressive piece of kit that the most powerful country on earth could ever produce at the time. And now most of you will be carrying around many thousands of times more computing power just in your pockets, which you'll be using for Snapchat and everything else. But we don't know, for example, how driverless cars or automation in manufacturing or automation in services will affect us. So how many people who drive as Uber drivers or lorry drivers will lose their jobs because we'll have automated cars? We don't know, but it will happen. Climate change. Although, as you'll see in this survey, about half the public globally believe that the scientists don't agree about climate change, actually the scientists do agree. 96% of scientists say that climate change is happening. If you can imagine the hottest summer you can ever remember, the time when it was absolutely boiling, imagine that as your average summer. And that is probably what is most likely to happen later this century. Political change. In the early 1990s, where are the historians? Any historians in the room? Yay, best people. I'm a historian. In the 1990s, at the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union collapsed, an American professor called Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History. We would all live happily together in a neoliberal sort of state, prosperous democracies everywhere, and peace would break out. As ISIS or President Trump, who we'll come to in a minute, show us, very unlikely. So we're moving from a world where there is what's called the Washington Consensus, where everybody agrees that the United Nations will decide things, to a world that's much more like when this building was constructed in 1905. A world of competing major powers. Which really is what the word multipolarity means. Other things, uneven economic growth. You are lucky that you are in London and not in Bolton or Huddersfield. London's opportunities are massively greater. There's a woman at the BBC, an economist called Stephanie Flanders, and she describes London as a great city attached to a crap country. And what she means by that is the gap in terms of productivity between this city and, say, the northeast of Britain. Population change. Europe is going to be the oldest continent on Earth, and one of the best things for prediction actually is demography, the science of how long you'll live. You can be fairly confident about how long you'll live, which is good, because it's longer than I'm going to live. But there are going to be some very, very big changes. So we already have in Britain 36,000 people over 100 years old. Somebody's going to have to look after these people. In Japan, they've stopped, when you make 100 in Japan, you get from the emperor a solid silver cup to drink sake from. They've stopped making them in solid silver now because there are so many people over 100, they can't afford it anymore. Now you get one that's silver plated. In Britain, according to the Office of National Statistics, if any of you make it to be 100 or 116, and at the moment people do, so it's quite possible that one of you may make it to 116, but by 2117, there are estimated to be 1 million people in Britain who will be over 100 years old. 1 million people. So, and that is something that we can be fairly confident about. The other thing, and you in this room represent this, globalization and migration. People in the West are very divided about that. Britain is actually becoming more positive towards immigration over the last few years, but it is still a very divisive fact, but it's not going to stop. You can't stop people looking for better opportunities around the world, and so that again will continue to change the planet. All of those things are absolutely certain. Exactly what they mean and exactly how they play out, more difficult, but we don't know. But what we have done now is try to look at public opinion around the world and look at the things that the world is worried about now, both in Britain and elsewhere, and we've come up with about 8 things that we think you might want to think about. So we've covered all of these countries, just added in Indonesia and Peru and Mexico. It's a huge study, covers 400 different questions. All of this stuff is available online if you want to look at it for anything. And it covers absolutely everything. So even sex. The internet is making young people's expectations about sex unrealistic. All over the world, everybody says that the availability of pornography on the internet is tending to make people have unusual ideas about what sex is going to be like, except the Japanese, who may have been strange to begin with. But everybody else, increasingly, the little green dots show the answers in 2013, and the 2014 answers are shown there. In Britain, 7 out of 10 people think that you have got strange ideas about sex because of the internet. Perception or reality, you tell me. But that's this is what people think. Right, we're not going to talk about it today. The 8 trends that I want you to think about. One is what I would call the crisis of the elites. The next is uncertainty is the new normal. We don't know about the future and we feel more worried about it. The battle for attention, which many of you are engaged in now and will be later today. Simplicity and control as a reaction to that. This idea of people wanting to feel in control, wanting to feel that they can control both their time and, in a sense, the world. And partly as a reaction, and again, some of this is going on in this room as well, the rise of tradition. We are actually going back to versions of the past because we feel insecure sometimes about the present. Generation strains, hugely important. One of the biggest differences between people in Britain today is not between black people or white people, it's not between rich people and poor people, it is simply between younger people and older people, and particularly young educated people and older, less educated people. And that is very acute here in Britain, but it's also present all over the world. Then we have health. One of the reasons I can talk about there maybe being 1 million people over 100 in 2117 is simply because we are getting healthier and we are living longer and longer. We're also getting fatter and fatter, which we need to talk about, but certainly we think that's important. And finally, the optimism divide. If we're sitting in London or Paris or Rome or New York or Chicago or LA, we feel very differently about the world than if we're sitting in Jakarta, Mumbai, or Delhi, or Shanghai. And there's a very big gap between these different parts of the world. So these are things that we think you might want to think about. So the crisis of the elites. I mean, here are the 2 men of the year last year. Donald and Nigel, 2 self-made men of the people. They're taking back control in a golden lift, and it's great. And that is meant to be the future. I hope not, but it is a sign that people are willing to vote for people like Donald Trump, that many people are very anxious about the way the world is going. And actually, it is a divide in this country. Even in London, 40% of people voted to leave the European Union. In Britain as a whole, of course, it was a very close-run thing. Both of those people and the things that they represent are the crystallization, the momentary crystallization of a real sense of unhappiness that is sweeping Western Europe and America since the crash, which has accelerated since the crash of 2008, which you've grown up in. And generally what we see, and these are the global figures, my government does not prioritize the interests of people like me. The economy is rigged for the advantage of the rich and powerful. Even in lovely Sweden, lovely country, very good welfare state, the majority of people say the system is rigged for the rich and powerful. I feel like a stranger in my own country. Britain is about mid-table on that. The French and the Americans are obsessed about it. I don't identify with what my country's become. Experts like me, don't understand my life, and I wish we had a strong leader and not the current government. Give me a dictator to fix things. And those feelings are present all across the world. Britain is actually a bit less strong in its feelings like that than, say, the French, but those things are there. And then who do we trust? Well, not many people. So do you trust banks? Not really. Big companies? Not really. Politicians? No. The media? Definitely not. So who are you going to rely on? And actually, the most trusted organizations in the world are supermarkets. They're on your side. They tell you all the time. You can go in there. You can see what they're doing. They're trying to help you live well for less. Every little helps. You've seen their advertising. Now, we shouldn't overdo this because actually trust isn't collapsing all over the world. We've never trusted politicians. My favorite ever opinion poll was one done in 1944. Anybody know what was happening in August 1944? World War II. So in August 1944, the British and the Americans were invading France to fight the Nazis. We had a coalition government. And in August 1944, one of the earliest opinion pollsters, a man called George Gallup, did a survey of the British. And he asked the British, do you think the politicians in this country are acting in the interests of the country, in their own interests, or in the interests of their political party? And even in August 1944, when we were engaged in a war against Adolf Hitler, who wanted to wipe this country out, even then, only 35% said that the politicians were acting in the interests of the country. So the idea that we've sort of always loved our politicians and it's suddenly gone wrong is just not true. We've never trusted them, even in World War II. So another key thing is this sort of sense of uncertainty. Now actually, and if you read the books of Steven Pinker, we are living longer. While there are some problems with crime in parts of London, which may affect communities you're part of, overall, your chances overall of being murdered in Britain are the lowest they've been since 1978. Health services are infinitely better than in the past. Poverty is being eliminated all over the world, absolute poverty. And yet, people are very, very anxious about the future. Now, it could be because, loons may do something crazy at any time. Donald may let one off or something. But generally, it's weird. We're generally much better off, but we're just worried about the future. These are two things that when I was 10 years old in 1975, most people didn't have. And only 7 out of 10 people had the second thing. And those are a washing machine to wash your clothes and central heating. People had fires. Most people had a fire. They didn't actually have central heating. And now virtually everybody has those things. But we still think, and in fact a survey we just did of millennials, people born after 1985, showed that about 60% of them think things would have been better in the 1970s. So you've got no smartphone, you've got no computer, no central heating, and you want to live in the 1970s. Okay? But generally, what's interesting is that all over the world, people think, despite Steven Pinker's efforts, that we actually live in a much more dangerous world. In Britain, where are we? 80% of us say the world is more dangerous. And in Mexico, although Mexico, where it really is more dangerous, it's not much higher than in Britain. So generally, we're worried about threats. We worry about absolutely everything. Interestingly, I thought this was interesting. Do you think technical progress is destroying our lives? Destroying your life? And interestingly, millennials, your generation, well, actually, your Generation Z, actually. So I haven't met a load of Generation Z people like this before. So hello, Generation Z. Millennials are born before 2000. Zs start after 2000. But actually, millennials are more likely than my generation, the baby boomers, to say that technical progress is destroying our lives. So life is just being ruined by technology. Now, it's not all negative. Actually, a lot of people all over the world agree with the statement that all medical conditions and diseases will be curable. People in Indonesia, Turkey, India, a bit more cheerful than perhaps in Britain and Spain and America, but nevertheless, we know that your chances of surviving cancer now are massively better than they would have been 20 or 30 years ago if you get it. The other thing that's going on is something we call the battle for attention. You only have 24 hours in the day. Humanity has not managed to find extra ways to get more time. We sleep a bit less than we used to, but instead we're now bombarded by stuff. If I was trying to do marketing in the 1980s, I would have those ways of trying to communicate with people about my new product or my new service. Now, and of course you've still only got 24 hours to look at this stuff. And that is a real challenge. People are bombarded by messages. I find I love Amazon because I like books. And I've now got more books arriving on a daily basis from Amazon than I know what to do with. But at the same time, when I try and read them, I'm always, let's just go and look at Twitter, just see what's happening on there, or let's go and see if my friends have messaged me, or have I got another email? I'm constantly distracted. And actually, 74% of people in China, 68% of people here, just so all they do is look at screens. On average, you will each be spending 24 hours a week looking at this, looking at that. 24 hours a week looking at that. The average person now checks their phone 220 times a day. That's the average. Some of you might be doing more. Baroness Susan Greenfield says that Facebook is rotting your brain. Ben Goldacre of Bad Science of The Guardian says this is complete rubbish, but the guy who is in charge of Google says that because we're so interrupted all the time, we're having trouble thinking straight. The level of interrupt, the sort of overwhelming rapidity of information, is in fact affecting cognition. In other words, we can't think properly because we're interrupting our train of thought all the time. Again, not sure, but it's certainly there. Lots of people fed up with the advertising they get sent all the time, 75%. Lots of people all over the world actually stopping advertising, getting to people, which to my clients, who are the reason my industry covers the world, people like Unilever, who make the shampoo and toothpaste that you use, are very worried that they won't be able to communicate with people anymore. The overwhelming sort of bombardment of information is leading to what we've called the search for simplicity and control. People say, I want my life to be simpler. All over the world, whether they're rich or poor, life is too complicated. Now, what I don't know, because I don't have a time machine, is whether if I had done this survey in 1917 or 1817 or 1717, we would have still said that. Maybe we would have said, oh yes, railways. I mean, people were very worried about trains arriving in Britain. Some people were very concerned about bicycles when they became common about 120 years ago, because they feared that it would lead to men and women being able to spend too much time together, secretly. They thought bicycles were going to be the end of humanity. People believed in the early 19th century that you shouldn't go on a train because if you traveled over 35 miles an hour, the human frame wouldn't be able to stand it. So we're not sure, but there is certainly this feeling that life could be simpler. And this is an interesting guy. Choice and complexity, and let's call it a limited attention span, lead to behavioral market failures. Now, what is that? That's the posh way of saying that if you have too much choice, it's not good for you. We know that if we run a supermarket offering 25 varieties of jam, it sells less than if we offer people only 8 to choose from. The Conservative government has taken away a freedom that Mrs. Thatcher gave you. Mrs. Thatcher decided to give everybody in Britain the freedom to choose whether or not to have a pension, to save money for their retirement. She said, everybody's an adult, it's up to them. They shouldn't be made to do it. And as a result of that freedom, a quarter of adults now in Britain, until recently, had no pension at all because they looked at all the choices that were available of pensions and thought, well, I probably won't make it to 65. I'm having a great time anyway. I'm a smoker, so I won't make it to 65. So in that case, just won't worry about it. Mr. Cameron, another Conservative Prime Minister, but with the agreement of the Labour Party, took away that freedom. You will all be forced, when you start work, to get a pension. You will not have a choice. Because actually, we found that giving people that choice leads to bad decisions. So people want simplicity, and we need, in some ways, to make things simple for them. And at the same time, we're worried about control, and we're sort of very paranoid about privacy. Is the government reading everything I do on my phone? Is big business reading everything I do on my phone? We will all lose privacy in the future because of what new technology can do. British, 82% of people think that that's going to be the case. And so, again, that sort of sense of anxiety, I've got all this stuff, but can I be in control? And then with all of this angst about the future, uncertainty, we've got something we call the rise of tradition, wanting to go back to the past. I want my country to be the way it used to be. And in Britain, it's 49%. Now, I don't know if they mean before the National Health Service, when we lived to about 50, and diphtheria, etc. I don't know. The Americans are very keen. Do they mean going back to 1960, 1860, before the abolition of slavery? When do they want to go back to? And I think the point is that there isn't actually a fixed point that people want to go back to. But at the moment, all over the world, there is a rising attractiveness of the past. The past is a place of security and certainty. So you've got 80% of people who say tradition is an important part of society. Your parents' generations, how important is tradition to them? How important is it to you? Now, do we want to go straight back to the past? Because at the same time, and this is the challenge, 80% of people also say, actually, we don't have to do things the way we've always done them in my country or my family. It's up to everybody to work out their own set of principles to guide their decisions. So people are divided. But there are some quite clear things. We don't believe, for example, except in Indonesia and Russia, that women should stay home and have babies and not work. Only 22% of people in Britain think that the role of women in society is to be good mothers and wives. However, and the other point about those 22% is they're mostly old. So when they're in about 10 years, the idea of women just staying at home and having children will be a very strange idea in most of Britain. Not in Indonesia and Russia and India, but in much of the world. And that's been one of the biggest changes in the world in the last 50 years, has been the feminization of work. The idea of women going out to work. It's one of the reasons why Britain is more prosperous than it used to be, and most countries are, because you have two people in a household of a man and a woman earning money, which you wouldn't have done 100 years ago. And then a key thing, and maybe you can tell me how this feels, is something we've called generation strains. There are big differences between the generations. This chart shows the number of people who say they always support the same party. The top grey line is people who were born before 1945, so they're now over 70 years old. And you can see that pretty much for the last 30 years, they've always said, I always vote for the same party. I'm always Tory, or I'm always Labour. My generation, I'm a baby boomer. I was born in 1965, so the baby boomers are born between 1945 and 1965. Less likely to say that. Generation X, 66 to 79, less likely. Gen Y, born after 1980, less likely still. Now, the interesting thing about this chart is the lines are not crossing over, but the people at the top do not have the secret of eternal life. They will all die. Unfortunately, unless any of you know the secret of eternal life, mortality is 100% ultimately. But as those people at the top leave the planet and go somewhere else, we are left with more and more people who just do not stick to a single party, because your generation is very different from my generation and indeed the one before it. And that applies to a whole load of issues. Misogyny, whether we're sexist towards women or not, homophobia, whether we're scared of gay people or not. These attitudes are shifting very, very dramatically. But at the same time, we're very pessimistic about young people, and young people are pessimistic about themselves. Do you think today's youth will have a better or worse life than their parents? In China, Peru, India, Indonesia, and Brazil, yes, life will be better there. Average income in China, they're celebrating at the moment, I was just in Shenzhen, is about $6,000 a year. In Britain, it's about $33,000 a year. So the Chinese are very optimistic. If you're only earning $6,000 and you're going to be earning $8,000 soon, this is great. If you're earning $33,000 and you've only got 1% inflation or 1% pay rise, you won't be feeling so cheerful. But Britain, only 22% think that young people will be better off, and the figure for young people isn't much different. So some real sort of pessimism. And if you look at who is getting richer in Britain at the moment, it's old people. The over 60s are now 11% better off than they were at the time of the crash, and it is the 22 to 30-year-olds who are really feeling the pinch. And this is a huge challenge. If young people are not going to get the same quality of pensions, are not going to be able to buy a house in the way that their parents did, what's the outcome? Healthier world. Generally, people acknowledge that they need to eat the right stuff all over the world, even though the world is getting fatter and fatter. Obesity now kills far more people than starvation. More people die of heart attacks and get cancer because they're fat than starve to death in our world today. They've got too many calories rather than too few. But people know that, but at the same time, lots of people worried about their weight. Interestingly, of course, very little relationship between how worried they are and how worried they should be. The Americans are the fattest people on earth, but only 51% of them are worried about their weight. The Japanese are very unhappy about their weight, but they eat a lot more fish and have a much better body mass index than the Americans. So, again, perception and reality, not always the same, but certainly a challenge. Lots of people want to be able to challenge doctors, get a second opinion, want to be in control. We do know that healthcare will improve in some countries. Look at the Brazilians. Now, have anybody been to Brazil? Well, if you do go there, do not visit the hospital. It is not a good experience. In Britain, we are some of the happiest people on the planet in terms of how proud we are of our health service, but actually we're also the most pessimistic about its future. Will we be able to support it? Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany today, and probably after the election on Sunday, still Chancellor of Germany, makes a very important point about Europe. Europe has 15% of the global population. It has 25% of the wealth of the world, so much more wealth than its people. That's why it's a rich country. But it spends 50% of all global spending on pensions, healthcare, and benefits on the planet. And the question is, will it be able to sustain that in future, or will we have to do something different? And finally, I just think this is a very important thing. As we're sitting here in London, if we were in Jakarta, or if we were in Shanghai, we would probably be feeling different. The first thing is that the world is very divided about the process that has made it richer and more open, which is globalization. You can see that the Indians, Chinese, Peruvians think that globalization is good. The Belgians and the French think globalization is bad. We're in the middle, rather mixed up about it. And then when you come on to the future, I want to achieve success even if I have to totally change the way I live. Britain, Germany, we're not sure. We're quite comfortable often, actually. India and Mexico, South Africa, they will do what is necessary to succeed. If that means moving hundreds of miles, moving to a city where you don't know anyone, they will do that stuff. Your families have made some of those transitions. And will Europe sink into complacency? We don't know. But the developing world is striving. And, again, big differences around the world. Does having the iPhone X make you happy? Will it make you happy? The evidence is actually for your age group, it will make you happy much more than if your parents had one, but you will get bored of it after about 6 months. But in China and India, having the latest car, having the latest plastic surgery in Brazil, right up there, is really, really important. To the West, a bit less so. So some big differences. So, overall, when we look at what unites the world or divides the world, these are the people who are most alike. So the British and the Australians, interestingly the Germans and the Japanese, the French and the Belgians, the Italians and the Polish, Argentinians and Brazilians, Indians, South Africans and Chinese. There's some big differences across the world that we should always be aware of. And I think, finally, yes, good, okay, I'm just seeing where I was. Even though there are some big differences, interestingly, most people all over the planet say that we have more things that unite us than divide us. So whether you're in Turkey, Australia, China, or Britain, 7 out of 10 people say, actually, ultimately, we have more things that unite us. The people who are different are the Japanese, the Koreans, and the French. The French in particular. I work for a French company, so I can tell you about the French. Bit less enthusiastic, but overall, perhaps an optimistic note. So those are some things I think to think about. I hope that's helpful. If you want to talk about anything else, I'm very happy to, but I think it's going to be an exciting century, and I just wish I was 16 or 17 again. Thank you.